All the way back in secondary school, my form tutor used to form out this competition where he would divide us all up into groups and we would watch portions of a movie at the beginning of that week, and then by the end of that week, he would quiz us as to what exactly happened in the movie that we had seen. The movie that I can recall the best that we used to watch was The Dark Crystal. I was mesmerised, intrigued with the animatronics and puppetry. It just wowed me. But only about 4 weeks in, the rest of the classroom were not fairly impressed with The Dark Crystal, so my form tutor swapped it out for Over the Hedge instead, which went down much better. But I wanted to finish watching The Dark Crystal, so I hopped onto YouTube, as at the time you could watch the full movie on the site. It was a fan edit, Winnie the Pooh in The Dark Crystal. It was, fairly interesting to say the least, but hey, I could finally watch it from beginning to end, with portions of Winnie the Pooh occasionally popping up here and there. This would be merely the beginning of my Dark Crystal fandom, as from then on out, I began researching anything Dark Crystal, and at the time, there were intriguing stories about the potential of a follow-up in the work. So today, we're going to be relaying the history and production of Power of the Dark Crystal, the sequel that never was. But you never know, maybe it happened in another time, in another world, in the Age of Wonder. The confirmation of a Dark Crystal sequel in the works came about on May 13th of 2005, reported by Variety. The original writer, David Odell, was returning back to pen the screenplay. The plans were to film the movie that fall. It would combine both practical puppets and CGI animation, and get it ready for release in early 2007. Then later, it would be followed up with an animated series, in a similar style to Nickelodeon's Avatar: The Last Airbender, as well as creating an interactive video game. Any mentions of plot details are very soft, as it only mentions Jen and Kira being the rulers of this new world, although for an initial announcement this is to be expected, to get people excited and not to be too descriptive. According to the article, a director was yet to have been assigned on board. For people that had only been following the story since the early 2010s, and had only been relying on video outlets as their source of the news, this project seemed to be very distant from Jim Henson. As of Unboxing Day of 2012, Entertainment Tonight posted on their YouTube channel an archival interview of Frank Oz and Jim Henson round about the premiere of The Dark Crystal. It was in this that the directors were inquired about the possibility of a follow-up.
The story itself doesn't lend itself to a sequel. We will not follow it with a sequel to this picture. The story itself is complete.
To a newcomer of the Dark Crystal universe, this upload seemed fairly cut and dry, that the man and legend himself, Jim Henson, had no desires for a continuation, although, to any online user that had been following the story since close to the very beginning, it was revealed in a 2006 article by MTV that the film's original writer David Odell had actually been in talks with Jim Henson about some kind of follow-up.
You could tell another story in the same world.
So I suppose Jim's logic that if it was within the same setup, then it might as well be a continuation of some kind. Although seemingly the project didn't get inherently far. From the very scant and little information that's available about the 80s rendition, it seems that it was only something within Jim's head. But according to Lisa Henson, daughter of the late Jim Henson and now CEO of his company, Odell had a pretty good memory on what the original story outline was. Thus, with the assistance of his wife, they wrote out a full feature plot. But why start the project now after 15 years of Jim Henson's passing? Well, the article draws some comparisons of The Dark Crystal and Lord of the Rings. Return of the King just released some years prior, so perhaps the Jim Henson Company saw it as appropriate timing to embellish in the fantasy genre. Maybe now at that time a Hollywood executive would more likely back a project filled with mysterious creatures and marvelous magic. In February of 2006, it was additionally announced that Genndy Tartakovsky would be behind the wheel of directing, which would have made it his first theatrical feature film. In the build-up to the release, flyers and teaser posters would be prepared to excite long-term Jim Henson fans. Although progress on the film went steadily quiet, its release date was gradually pushed back from 2008 to 2009. This was discussed at the panel in the 2007 San Diego Comic-Con on the delays of the project. This was recorded and was made accessible in the 21st episode of the Henson podcast, although unfortunately it's no longer available on the Jim Henson website, and during the making of this video I couldn't locate this specific episode. but from what bits and pieces I was able to gather about what was said in the podcast, that the movie has had somewhat of a setback, but reassuring fans that things will be back on track, although given that the release date is still quite some time away, that nothing more will be shared at this point, but will share following updates with fans once they can finally confirm production details behind the curtain. Although, while we don't know the full extent of what was going on behind the scenes during this time, the movie was seemingly stuck in production hell. 2009 would come and pass with no movie in sight. The only new bit of information that came out that year was that Craig Pearce had rewrote the screenplay. In 2010, it was announced that Australian company Omnilab would be both co-financing the movie and providing the CGI elements, but the feature would still retain the puppets and animatronics from the Jim Henson Company. Furthermore, the movie would be photographed in 3D, a trendy aspect from theatrical movies in the early 2010s. In a 2010 December interview in Miss Magazine, Lisa had explained as to why production was going so slowly, was that the new script had made the movie twice as big as before, making for a very slow and tedious pre-production. The following year in September, there was a panel at the Museum of Moving Image, dubbed Jim Henson Friends and Family, where Jim Henson's daughter, Charlotte Henson, was asked about the progress of the sequel. She responded by saying that things are currently on pause. Not exactly the most optimistic news. And sadly, the final nail in the coffin for the sequel would be confirmed in early 2012, that it had been cancelled. Omnilab had pulled out of the project, and later that year when Gindi was interviewed, he was completely unaware of the movie's status and had not heard back from the Jim Henson Company in quite some time, so he had already presumed for a long while that the movie was just not happening. But that same year, Louis Leterrier had approached the Jim Henson Company to get the project back off the ground, but as he was pitching the project around to movie studios, he had found something more compelling in the notes about the origins of the world by Jim Henson and Frank Oz. So the sequel movie shifted to be a prequel series instead. The project was officially announced in May of 2017 after a production deal had been settled with Netflix, and that the sequel script would be instead turned into a comic book based on the Pearce script. It would be publicised between 2017 and 2018 with 12 volumes. Lisa Henson has confirmed herself that this will be as far as this rendition of the story will go. In other words, it won't be turned into a movie. Still though, Dark Crystal fans have pondered as to how far the movie did get, as it was reported that both storyboards and prototype puppets were created. Likely nothing on the level of a half-completed movie, but perhaps some fairly serious pre-production work such as animatics and a plentiful amount of test footage. As I was researching missing media relating to the Dark Crystal, I was speaking to a fellow good friend and a well-established seeker of the LMW community who has been involved with a fair amount of lost media searches.
I'm Yoshi Killer. I am a lost media enthusiast. I collect PDF files and paper. I found clips of Meso Blues once. That was my first big find, and then I found this. I found Dark Crystal.
What Yoshi had actually found was the original 2005 script of Power of the Dark Crystal, scripted by the original writer of the first film, David Odell, alongside his wife, Annette Duffy. And since this was later rewritten down the road, there are some semi-differences between this and the comic book version. Today, Yoshi has uncovered quite a number of unmade scripts, so in our little interview, I was quite curious to ask as to how on earth do these end up on the internet to begin with.
Tracking the origin of how scripts start sharing, it's really confusing because oftentimes no one knows. It's like a bootleg. How did this Queen concert start circulating? And it's oh, someone recorded it and then started trading it around and selling it, and then it got online. But we never know. When it comes to these scripts, someone makes a photocopy, someone that works and shares it with someone else, one of his friends, and they make a copy and they make a copy, and then someone puts it online. And then if you know people, they would, you can negotiate trades with them, trade something you have for something rarer, and vice versa. Sometimes they're just nice enough to just give you it. Pretty easy if you know people and you're a good negotiator. I just fell into it. I was I find this rare script for Toy Story 3, an unmade version of Toy Story 3, and then I find Toy Story 4, and then I post it on this website, and someone else starts posting other scripts this, and I never knew about a sequel to Beetlejuice where he goes to Hawaii, an early draft of Back to the Future that involves a time machine fridge, and then I was oh, there's more, so I started collecting, and I never stopped. You just kind of like message people. I just saw you had scripts. I'm like, hey, you want to talk about scripts? And he's like, oh yeah. And we started talking and we traded and I got a bunch of rare ones. He pointed me in the direction of certain websites and forums. And then, yeah, I got deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole because of him. And we still trade and we still talk. He's a really nice guy. I was in this server with Scribbles, still am. Yeah, I ended up like posting on this Discord server that like, oh, I found this rare script. And he's like, oh, is it Dark Crystal 2? And I thought about that and I realized I know someone with Dark Crystal 2. I reached out to that guy and I said like, hey, can I have that? And he's just like, oh, sure. And I go back to the server and I post it. And then Scribbles responds with, bloody hell, I was joking. And then I find out later it was lost media. So, you know, that happened. But hey, got this kick-ass video from it.
So now, for a wee bit of fun, let's go through the plot and the script. This material will be donated to the Lost Media Wiki, so if you want to read it in your own time and you don't want me to spoil it, then I shall be leaving a link in the description down below. But as for everybody else who prefers the video format, well, here we go. The story opens with a bird flying high, an eyeball within its talons, spotting an oncoming visitor heading in the direction of the Crystal Palace. The bird quickly travels back to the castle, entering into a study room, returning the eyeball to a young Olgra. You see, in the Crystal Chamber, there are a plentiful amount of mirrors reflecting the rays of the three suns onto the crystal, constantly igniting its powers. Olgra used this to make her youthful once more. She now lives in the palace, as well as Jen and Kira, who are now the new rulers of this world, although unlike Olgra, they have aged. Now, since Kira was brought back to life by the Urskex in the prior movie, the crystal won't be able to heal her once again, but Jan can take full advantage of the crystal if he really wants to, but he would rather age alongside Kira. Oh, and if you were wondering about Fizzgig, yes, he's still kicking it. Anyway, Olgra alerts them that there's an oncoming visitor. She's suspicious, so tells them to not let them in, but Jen wants to see what the visitor has to say. Meanwhile, the travelling wanderer, she stumbles upon a small body of water. It is shallow, but she's unable to cross it, because she's actually a fire creature from below the ground, and cannot interact or touch anything that's cold. Thankfully for her, a boat boy is not too far away, and is kind enough to give her a lift, and they both travel to the palace. Along the journey, we learn some tidbits about them. The young lady is named Firma. She's from a centre-of-the-earth-like world from Fra. Her species is called Human, and that she was sent by her tribe mother to the Crystal Palace. We then learn that the boat boy's name is Frigo, and he sadly no longer has a family. After a long travel, they finally get to the Crystal Palace. They just need to cross a wooden bridge. Unfortunately, because of the radiating heat from Firma, she unintentionally begins to burn the bridge by her feet. Frigo is able to grab her and pull her back to safety, but at the cost of burning his bare hands. Firma and a group of podlings quickly rush and come to his aid. Olgra, coming to assess the situation, leads the two travellers to the Crystal Chamber, where the crystal is able to heal Frigo's hands. They then come to Jen and Kira. Firma then explains her situation, that there's a sun at the centre of the planet. It's slowly dying, but the tribe mother has foreseen a vision, where a shard from the crystal will be able to heal the sun. But Jen knows that this could lead to the return of the Mystics and Skeksis. And of course the Skeksis were responsible for completely devastating Fra. Firma insists that the shard will be returned, and Kira feels like that they should help. But Jen doesn't want to take that risk. But Kira is at least able to persuade him to let them stay for the night. Although Firma later wakes up in the middle of the night, convincing Frigo to steal the shard from the crystal. However, as they make their attempt, an Urskek appears in front of them, with Fizzgig trying to intervene to stop them as well. In the skirmish, Frigo trips, cracking and embedding his arm into the crystal. By consequence, this splits the one Urskek into two, the Mystic and the Conniving Chamberlain. Frigo is just able to break free from the crystal, although now with a shard embedded in his hand. The Chamberlain points Frigo and Firma towards a secret passageway, and the three of them make their escape, while Fizzgig, remembering the Chamberlain, attacks and bites onto his robes, but the Skeksis takes no notice as he's rushing out. When outside of the Crystal Palace, Chamberlain tries to convince Frigo and Firma to hand over the shard so he can free his people, but the both of them refuse until the centre of the sun is healed. Besides, Frigo is unable to remove the shard from his hand. Chamberlain attempts to force it out, but Firma burns his hand before the Chamberlain proceeds any further, ultimately forcing the Skeksis to cooperate. They all agree to go and see the tribe mother Enza, that she might know on how to remove the shard, and with the underground habitat could be overly humidly warm to travel in. Chamberlain promises that he knows a secret to protect Frigo from the world of the heat. Jen, Kira and Olga stumbling upon the mystic and just finding out as to what's happened. They travel to one of the old Skeksis rooms, and lifting up a scepter, they resurrect a group of Garthams, and placing in the main leader Gartham, Olga's eyeball. With the command of the scepter, they send out the Gartham to find Firma, Frigo and the Skeksis. Meanwhile, back with the three of them who've been able to make some progress, they see the Gartham in the distance making their exit from the Crystal Palace, with Chamberlain insisting that they must pick up their pace. But it's only there and then that he's realised that Fizzgig has been biting onto his robes. The Skeksis is infuriated, while Firma prompts Chamberlain to ask nicely to Fizzgig to let go. Eventually Fizzgig does when he's tempted with some food. This begins an ongoing gag, where the Chamberlain is often told off by Frigo and Firma, and having no upper hand on the situation, the Chamberlain must swallow his pride and has to begrudgingly act nice, or at least make up some convoluted excuse for his blunt behaviour. The crystal shard is starting to grow across Frigo's arm, turning it all to crystal, so Frigo desperately wants to get a move on as well. Travelling through a forest, the Chamberlain, feeling a little bit peckish, breaks open a rotting log, filled to the brim of grubs and maggots, which he devours. We learn that Firma and Frigo are both vegetarians, this being one of the contributing factors as to why Fergo left his family. And the species that Firma comes from can only rely on eating warm and hot things, surviving on a diet of rock and pebbles, with anything cold being poisonous to her. It's at this point that Frigo and Firma begin to realise that they may have romantic feelings for one another. The two lovebirds get in a brief confrontation with a hunter, although the hunter is scared off when the Chamberlain spooks him away. It's here that Frigo befriends a little animal called a Glubo. We discover that he can speak any animal language. Back at the Crystal Palace, we find out that Olga is starting to age away, and that night, after suffering a nightmare, Kira goes to see the mystic. He tells her that he has a vision that a hand will heal the crystal. Kira goes to wake up Jen, trying to convince him that they must go out to find Frigo and Firma, although Jen suggests that they should discuss this in the morning and goes back to sleep. From there, Kira decides to go out on her own, taking the Gartham staff and taking a ride on a Landstrider. Back with the rebel trio, they all get netted by the hunters. Firma in particular is put out by buckets of water. Weak, cold and shivering, she's easy to carry by the hunters. While travelling, they get sidetracked by a bunch of Glubus, which there are many, so they briefly leave the Skeksis and Firma behind, but bring Frigo along to capture the bundles of Glubus. They eventually track down all the creatures to one massive tree, which actually turns out to be the Glubus' mother. She swipes and scares away the hunters. Meanwhile, the Chamberlain was able to trick Fizzgig into chewing away the net. Once he breaks free, he scampers off. Frigo reunites with Firma, she comes back round, slowly standing to her feet. Once she warms back up, they both make a move. The Gartham are not too far behind, dealing with the last of the trappers. Kira as well catches up, although a wounded hunter startles the Landstrider, who lunges forward, flinging Kira into a tree. Her delicate wings impaled on the branches, unable to move, and she drops the Gartham scepter, breaking into a million different pieces. Thankfully for her, Jen on a Landstrider is able to come to her aid. Kira explains to Jen as to why she was so determined to get the crystal shard back herself. Through dream fasting, she shares a vision, casting all the way back to the ending of the original film when she died. She recalls ascending up to the afterlife. Heading towards the light, she sees her mother, telling Kira to go back, it's not her time yet, and that someday she will heal the crystal again, and to not trust the Gartham. She as well sees the hollow earth with the sun in the middle. Jen and Kira both reconcile their relationship, with Jen feeling that there was something distancing them, keeping them both apart. Kira didn't know that's how Jen felt. Jen relays that he wanted to do everything to be close to her, because she is his life. They both return back to the Crystal Palace, where the mystic is able to conduct a medicine to heal Kira. Meanwhile, Firma and Frigo are at the entrance of the underworld. However, the Skeksis is there waiting for them. And with the Gartham not too far behind, Firma and Frigo have no choice but to allow the Skeksis to accompany them, travelling down the tunnel. They then stumble upon the Pool of Mithriam. Chamberlain recalls a story where the legend goes that whoever swims in it can live in both worlds, above and below Fra. Frigo dives in, and when he touches Firma's hand, he's able to do so without it being burnt. Their celebration is short-lived when the crab-like creatures are just right on their tail, but the trio are just able to escape through a small crevice hole that the Gartham are unable to fit in. They travel on a raft down a lava river. The Skeksis, feeling a bit peckish, looks towards Fizzgig while licking his lips. Firma, concerned for the well-being of Fizzgig, advised Frigo to hide the little fluff ball in his pocket. And then we get the franchise's first true adult joke. Caution, it's not exactly subtle.
Awkward.
You wouldn't eat Fizzgig?
No, never. Dear little fish pig. How could I? You might want me to hold your little fuzzbug for you if you two want to mate.
What?
Not with you around. Don't mind me. I'll just watch. I've heard it's quite a sight.
Well, this just sounds really inappropriate, right, Huck?
You should see some of the fan art that's been made of these characters.
Well, certainly interesting, wasn't it? Thank you to Old Headphones and Huck for taking part in this. Highly recommend checking him out as he mainly reviews content from the UK. After a turbulent ride along the lava, the Chamberlain demands that they stop by the riverbank, which when they do, he grabs Fizzgig and runs into the dark. Frigo wants to save Fizzgig, but is unable to when the boat starts drifting away. Sometime later, they finally arrive to the centre of the planet where they can see the dying sun. They then find Firma's tribe, but as for Enza, the tribe mother, they arrive during her funeral. She had passed away during Firma's journey, which she's absolutely devastated. Her body is placed in a catapult and is flung towards the sun as part of their ritual. Thankfully, the priest does recall on what Enza said that needed to be done. Step into the empty core to the bright light we had before. Hurl the crystal from below and send it where it longs to go. Chamberlain emerges out of the bushes, proclaiming that he knows exactly what it means. But one of the vocal humans, dishevelled and fed up, says to throw Frigo into the sun and see what happens. But the Gartham show up, disrupting the experiment, giving Firma and Frigo an opportunity to escape and hide in a valley of molten rock. Chamberlain, now leading the humans, releases Fizzgig and commands all of them to follow the fluff ball, as he will be searching in the direction for Firma and Frigo, although they're reluctant and scared to do so, as the valley is home to the fire people. So Chamberlain marches on his own. Firma, Frigo and Fizzgig all make a run for it. Frigo is briefly distracted by a fire lady, trying to seduce him. But Firma comes to his aid by putting out the fire lady with some mud. Chamberlain is as well confronted by a flame Skeksis, tempting him with some grub, but Chamberlain is not falling for it. Past Volcanic Valley is a black swirling vortex tornado, but coming through the valley is the Skeksis, the humans and the Gartham. Stuck between the two, Firma and Frigo are now up a hill with nowhere else to go. Thankfully for a ritual by the mystic, the Gartham split apart, but the Skeksis and the humans are still on their way. Right then and there, Frigo is blown into the tornado, utilising the powers of his crystal arm. He spins so rapidly fast that he punches the earth and drills all the way back up to the crystal chamber, with Firma, Fizzgig and the Chamberlain sucked into the hole, along with the head of the main leader Gartham, arriving to the same destination as well. Frigo's powerful hand then collides with the crystal, exactly where it was originally embedded, and he can remove it out with ease. The sharp remove of his now normal hand. Chamberlain and the Mystic reunite once more, and a ray of light emitting from the crystal travels down to the underworld, through the hole that's just been drilled, and heals the sun at the centre of the planet. Olgra fishes out her eyeball and is back to her youthful self. Things are restored once more in the world of Fra. Both this script and the comic book share more or less the same plot beats, although with many differences, such as the storyline is set 1,000 years after the original film, where by this point a civilization of Gelflings have fully returned back to Fra. Jen, Kira and Fizzgig are still very well alive, due to their elder selves being within suspended animation during all this time. The crystal itself is not as strong as it once was, and that the current Gelflings that are overlooking it are utilising it for their own financial gain. Frigo, where in the original script his species is never specified, his role was changed to a Gelfling named Kinso in the comic strip, being an outcast in the story, and he's not the one to shatter the crystal this time round. Instead it's Firma, without it being embedded in her hand. More than one mystic and Skeksis comes back round when the crystal is shattered, and Olgra is her good old self. Now, I don't usually consider these videos being reviews per se, as I don't exactly review the media that I'm looking at. Instead, I mostly keep things unbiased, just relaying the facts and leaving it up to the viewer to decide if they think the missing media was any good or not. Besides, I personally find it a little bit unfair to put your thoughts towards something that you haven't exactly seen. Speaking from personal experience, I've had comments from my Lost Shrek video, where people give full-fledged reviews like, whoo, let's slow down a little bit. The most of the plot we have at the moment is just one scene animatic. Like, it's a bit of a narrow window to judge the whole film on, by only one scene alone. But in this circumstance, we do have at the very least the whole plot laid out. And while I'm sure that David O'Dell would be feeling a little bit red knowing that I just basically summarised his whole first draft, oh, by the way, if you're watching this, mate, please forgive me. The script alongside the comic book, we can have a pretty good idea as to how the final product might have been. And honestly, I thought it was okay. The script is fairly simplistic, just like the original film, where it was a point A to point B adventure, so it fits in quite well with the Dark Crystal universe. Also, it was great seeing the Skeksis acting at mercy to cooperate with Frigga and Firma. He hates that he's not in charge of the situation. The Centre of Fra was certainly quite an interesting concept. I know of sequels who usually expand the world of the original. I can recall worrying that it may have been a bit too big of an idea, but I feel the story does naturally build up to our journey to the centre of the planet. If you asked me of what my idea would be to expand the world, exploring virtually a whole other world to Fra wouldn't have been my first idea. But hey, a sequel doesn't need to bend down to my preconceived ideas. But there are some bits of the script that I find a little bit sad. That during Jen and Kira's sentimental moment in the story, that we find out how Janice felt somewhat distant from her. Basically, they never quite had a happily ever after. Also, in the original script, it seems very much that Jen and Kira are the last of the Gelflings. There's no mention of them having kids, so pretty much once they're gone, the Gelfling race will be virtually extinct. Granted, if they decided to repopulate, their offspring would only have one way from there to continue. And genetically, it's not exactly the most ideal, but it's either that or extinction. Either way, I can easily imagine that it's not an easy situation for most people. Also, for a now reformed world, at least from the top of Fra, it doesn't seem to be as much populated like the original film. I kind of wonder if it was written with a lower budget in mind, because we've only got one Skeksis and Mystic. I think the comic book does go a long way to make it feel far more grand. Also, the story is kind of reminiscent of the original film, not to say that it directly plagiarizes the first one, but it ends up repeating the same goal of using a single shard to heal the world. I suppose its uphill battle is that it's got to contrive a way as to how the Mystics and Skeksis come back, which in the original script, why was there only one Earthscape that split apart? And then once they're back, the logical goal is to heal the crystal once more, which doesn't do too much new for the sequel, which I suppose is the ultimate reason as to why they did the prequel series instead. With only vague indications in the original film, there's a lot more to explore with Fra's backstory. But hey, I'm judging between a fully completed series and a first draft, where I've only got my imagination to picture the final execution, so it's completely fair and easy to say that I may be slightly biased towards what I can visually see. So who knows, maybe if the sequel was actually made, I might have a slightly different outlook. So, what did you lot make of the story? Did you enjoy it, or would you rather have Age of Resistance instead? Well, be sure to let me know in the comment section below. And hey, if this type of video is your cup of tea and you want to see more like it, then be sure to subscribe. Anyway, that will do. Ta-ta for now.